Take my bride, let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. Here's a question. What part of your car receives the most maintenance and attention from you, the driver? The answer is your windshield. Now, hear me out. We all have a rather intimate relationship with the windshield. We know when we hit bugs or get targeted by birds. We have onboard maintenance equipment, the wipers, to help keep it clean or free of rain while driving. Most gas stations have glass cleaning supplies at the pumps. If it's cracked or chipped, it can annoy the heck out of all of us as well as become unsafe. So today, we're going to look at the history of how this piece of glass became the most important and cared for feature on all of our cars. Now, glass itself has a long history. It is primarily made from silica, with other compounds sometimes added for color. It can be found naturally as the result of volcanic activity, lightning, or even large meteor strikes. The most well-known form of natural glass is obsidian, which was used by many cultures across the world for making cutting tools, ornamental beads, and carvings, and even weapons. Indeed, surgical tools with obsidian blades were in fairly common use even into the 19th century. The manufacturing of glass goes back at least 5,000 years. It was most likely discovered about the same time as kiln-fired pottery, as glass is often a byproduct of running an earthen kiln. One of the earliest types of glass making, called Egyptian phalanx, is at least that old. It was more of a glaze baked onto pottery items than true glass, but its manufacture led to true glass making. When and where true glass was first made is still debated, but it seems to have been around for about 4,000 years. Glass objects, mostly ornamental colored beads, show up in the archaeological record in Mesopotamia, India, and Egypt from the 2nd millennia BC. The making of large objects like cups, vases, and bowls soon followed, and by the 1st millennium BC, such items were reasonably common, though expensive. Such objects tended to be highly decorated with different strands of colored glass in the body of the work, and they were also often had designs carved and ground into them using similar techniques found in stone carving. Of course, colored glass does not have very many uses in cars. Clear, colorless glass became available during the classical period, with the Romans also developing glass blowing techniques, as prior to that time most glass was molded. Clear glass could be used for both windows and mirrors, though it had not been until the 17th century that glass manufacturing developed enough to actually produce such things on a large commercial scale. The major breakthroughs to allow this was the use of lead oxide to allow the glass to be formed more easily, and the invention of the glass roller, a device that could make large sheets of glass of uniform thickness, of course increased its availability. By the 18th century, clear rolled plate glass was common and cheap enough to be used for both windows and mirrors. It was during this time that glass products found their way onto and into the large horse-drawn coaches of England and Western Europe. Large coaches had lamps, be they oil lamps or candle ones. These lamps had glass lenses to amplify the light, the first headlights. Also, the passengers now had glass windows in the coach to both protect them from the elements and let them view the countryside as they traveled. Thirdly, many of the commercial coaches of the day had their own glassware, plates, cups, and the like, for wealthy passengers to enjoy some wine and cakes while they travel. Now, steam engines became quite common in industry during the 18th century, and at the turn of the 19th century, high-pressure engines not only ran factories, glass-making ones included, but also locomotives and road-going coaches. Steam power revolutionized the world, and the engines themselves did in fact use glass. There were 3 typical applications for glass components in such engines. There are various points of wear all over such engines, and at these points, oilers are installed to keep things lubricated. These oilers had clear glass bodies so that at a glance the engineer could see if they needed to be replenished. The boilers often had glass tube gauges. These would indicate how much water was in the boiler using a simple float mechanism. This was important because you don't want your boiler to run out of water while still under fire. Just ask Richard Trevithick why this is a bad thing. And of course, there were other gauges that monitored various pressures in the engine, and these gauges would usually have a glass plate over them to protect the delicate mechanism and pointing needle behind it. Some of these gauges would themselves be filled with oil to keep them in good working order despite the rather dirty and smoky environs that can be found in and around high-pressure steam engines. So when the first cars came along in the 19th century, they also had these glass components common to steam engines: oilers, glass tube gauges, and glass covers over other dials and such. Lights on early cars also had glass lenses, though electric lights on cars wouldn't become a thing until the early 20th century. Yet one thing that we associate with car glass was not part of early cars: windows and the windshield. The first cars were rather slow, and the idea of a glass windshield was slow to catch on. Indeed, instead, fashion designers of the time came up with attire to protect the driver and passengers. For men, this included heavy goggles, high collar coats, and scarves. For women, face cloths were all the rage, with scarves and sashes to tie down her lofty hat. However, by the early 1900s, cars were getting a lot faster, and these protective measures were proving to be inadequate. It was in 1903 that the first safety glass was invented, and it happened completely by accident, literally. A French artist, sculptor, and amateur scientist, a Monsieur Edouard Benedictus, was playing around in his lab with some new synthetic compounds, one of them being cellulose nitrate. He had a glass beaker filled with the stuff, and after pouring it out, left the beaker on the counter. Legend has it that he had a lab cat, and like all cats, decided that this glass beaker needed to be knocked off the counter. The beaker, of course, shattered upon impact with the hard floor. But because the inside of it was coated with this new compound, it didn't spread glass all over, but instead kept its shape while still being shattered. Benedictus was aware of the hazards of shattering glass, and this cat-induced experiment got him thinking. Over the next few years, he would continue to experiment until he came up with the ultimate solution. He eventually took a flat plane of glass and coated both sides of it with this material, along with a gelatin binder, and then tried to break it. The result? Glass that could be broken but would not send shards of sharp glass all over the place. He called this development triplex glass, and patented in 1910, laminated automotive safety glass had been born. But it would still take a while for his invention to make it onto cars. The first windshields on cars didn't appear until 1904, and these were just standard flat planes of window glass and were an option offered by various coach builders. And yes, they were quite dangerous. If a windshield on an early car broke while driving, massive shards of deadly glass would go flying into the driver and anyone else in the car, and most people considered this as a bad thing. Thus, glass windows and windshields on cars were not typical at the time, as they were seen as quite a hazard. Fortunately, the invention of laminated glass was a game changer for the car world. Henry Ford began to offer it as an option for the Model T in 1911, and in 1915, Oldsmobile became the first make of car to have windshields as standard equipment. Yet there were still problems with early laminated glass. Most significant was the tendency to discolor with age and exposure to sunlight. These early safety glass windshields and windows would turn brown over a few years and need to be replaced. It wouldn't be until after World War II that technology developed till laminated glass was something that wouldn't turn brown. But laminating alone was not enough. True, shards of glass wouldn't fly about when broken, but there were still shards of glass to deal with. Tempered glass, which first appeared in 1930, was the final piece of the modern auto glass puzzle. A tempered piece of glass is made in a process that adds pressure to its outer surfaces while the inside of it is not. This makes the glass under constant tension. So, if it breaks, instead of shattering into lethal shards of death, it crumbles into tiny little innocuous pieces. Tempered laminated glass became the standard across the automotive world by the late 1930s and is still the standard of the industry to this day. Of course, curved windshields came about also in the 1930s, and by the 1950s were commonplace on most cars. Windshield wipers also became common after World War I, be they operated manually or ran with a motor. The windshield of our cars protects us from debris, rain, bird droppings, and anything else that a road can throw at us. And let's face it, either take good care of your windshield or have to drive with a helmet and goggles to the local grocery store. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.